Fame is a cage with no visible bars. You build it yourself, deliberately, across years of extraordinary work, and only when it's finished do you understand what you've made. Freddie Mercury understood this better than almost anyone alive. At the peak of his career, he was one of the most recognizable human beings on earth. In London, New York, Paris, he could not enter a room without becoming the most significant thing in it. The air changed, attention redirected itself before he had spoken a word. He was permanently on the wrong side of the glass that separates the observer from the observed. And then he found Japan. In Japan, Freddie Mercury could walk down a street and be, with something approaching completeness, simply a person. His own success had made this experience unavailable almost everywhere else on Earth. What Japan gave him was something almost unbearably simple: the ability to exist in public without being seen. Queen arrived in Japan in 1975 under circumstances that were, by the standards of what followed, almost comically disproportionate. They had released 3 albums in Britain and achieved a solid but not extraordinary commercial success. They were known in the United Kingdom and beginning to develop a following in the United States. But they were not, by any conventional measure of the mid-1970s music industry, a band that anyone would have predicted would sell out venues in Japan before they had fully broken through in their home country. What had happened was something that the music industry of the era did not have a reliable framework for understanding. Queen's music had reached Japan ahead of Queen's marketing through the specific mechanisms of radio and music press coverage that operated differently in Japan than in the West, and had found an audience that was already waiting for them when they arrived. The reception at the airport when Queen landed in Japan in 1975 has been described by all 4 members of the band with a quality of genuine disbelief that suggests the memory never entirely normalized. Hundreds of fans, screaming, the specific intensity of Japanese fan devotion, which operates at a frequency and a commitment level that has no precise equivalent in Western pop culture. And in the middle of all of this, Freddie Mercury, who had spent his career to that point working to produce exactly this kind of response, standing at the arrival's gate, looking at what had come to meet him, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the thing he had been building was real. The first Queen tour of Japan in 1975 produced in Freddie Mercury a response that his bandmates have described across various interviews as something more than the expected excitement of a first major overseas success. It was something more specific and more personal. The concerts were extraordinary. The Japanese audiences brought to live music, a quality of attention and collective participation that was different from anything Queen had experienced in Britain or Europe. A kind of focused intensity that responded to every element of the performance with a precision and an enthusiasm that felt, to the people on the stage, like being heard very clearly from a very great distance. But what affected Freddie as much as the concerts was what happened in the hours between them. What happened in the streets? What happened when the performance was over and he walked out of the venue and into the city and discovered, with a surprise that he would describe to people close to him in the years that followed as one of the genuine revelations of his adult life, that nobody was looking at him. Not because he was invisible, but because the Japanese cultural relationship with fame and with famous people operated according to a completely different set of conventions than the ones he had grown up inside. And those conventions produced, for the person who was their accidental beneficiary, something that felt very close to freedom. The specific quality of Japanese fan culture that gave Freddie Mercury this experience is not simple to describe to people who have not encountered it. It is not indifference. Japanese Queen fans in 1975 were among the most devoted and the most knowledgeable audiences the band had ever played for. It is not a failure of recognition. Freddie Mercury was recognizable to the people who passed him on the streets of Tokyo, and many of them knew exactly who he was. It is something more like a cultural understanding, deeply embedded in Japanese social convention, that a person in public deserves the dignity of their privacy even when that person is famous, and that to intrude upon them, to approach them without invitation, to stare, to photograph without permission, to treat the celebrity as public property in the way that British and American tabloid culture had normalized was not acceptable behavior, regardless of who the person was. For Freddie Mercury, whose experience of fame in London and New York had accustomed him to a complete absence of this understanding. The effect was startling and immediate and profound. He could walk. He could look at things. He could stop at a shop and examine what was in the window and move on without the moment becoming an event. He could be in the world, in public, in his own body, without the world immediately reorganizing itself around the fact of his presence. Freddie Mercury's engagement with Japanese culture was not, as it might have appeared to casual observers, the superficial acquisition of exotic aesthetics that famous people sometimes perform when they encounter cultures they find attractive. It was something with more depth and more personal investment than that. He had always been drawn to precision and to craft, to things that were made with extraordinary care and extraordinary skill, where the intelligence behind the making was visible in the object itself. Japanese ceramics, which he began collecting on his first visit to Japan and continued to collect for the rest of his life, satisfied this specific appetite completely. The objects he found in Japanese shops and galleries, the specific quality of their glazes, the specific quality of the forms, the way they combined austerity with sensuality in a ratio that felt, to Freddie's eye, almost perfect, were unlike anything available in the Western art and antique markets he had been buying from. He also accumulated kimonos, Japanese woodblock prints, lacquerware, and objects from the traditional material culture of a society that had developed an aesthetic entirely distinct from anything in his own background. These things filled Garden Lodge. They were among the most personally significant objects in his collection. And their presence in the house was a physical record of what Japan had given him, not as a market, not as a fan base, but as a place. The comparison between what Tokyo gave Freddie Mercury and what London gave him is illuminating in ways that go beyond the obvious. London was his city, the city where he had built his career and his public identity, where Garden Lodge was, where Mary Austin was, where the specific geography of his adult life was laid down. He loved London, but London was also the city where he could not be private, where the tabloids tracked him, where his sexuality, in the years before he chose to be open about it, was a subject of constant press speculation that made simple public existence a managed and effortful thing, where being Freddie Mercury was a condition that operated at full intensity every time he left the house. Tokyo was something else. Tokyo was the city where he could take a taxi to a neighborhood he had never visited and walk its streets for an hour and return having been simply a man who had walked through a city. This experience, so ordinary as to be unremarkable for most people, so extraordinary for Freddie Mercury as to be among the most valued things in his life, was what Tokyo offered him and what no other major city he visited with the same frequency was able to provide. Brian May and Roger Taylor have both spoken across various interviews given across the decades about the specific quality of Freddie Mercury's behavior in Japan. Both describe a man who was visibly different from the Freddie they knew in Britain and Europe, not in the major ways, not in the ways that would have been legible as a fundamental change of character, but in the specific and revealing ways that show themselves when a person is operating with less of the self-management that their usual environment requires. He was calmer, he moved more slowly, he spent longer in shops, examining things with a genuine unhurried attention that was not the calculated performance of celebrity browsing, but the actual behavior of a person who was interested in what they were looking at and had the time and the peace to look at it properly. He talked more easily with the people he encountered. He laughed more freely. The specific quality of ease that Brian May has described watching in Freddie on the streets of Tokyo, a quality of physical relaxation that was not always visible in a man whose public life required constant alertness and constant management, is perhaps the most precise evidence available of what Japan actually gave him. Freddie Mercury returned to Japan on private visits that were not connected to Queen's professional schedule. These visits were made quietly, with small groups or alone, and they were not publicized. He would stay for periods of days or weeks, moving through Tokyo and sometimes beyond it, buying things, visiting temples and galleries and markets, eating in the restaurants he had identified on previous visits, reestablishing his relationship with a place that had become, across the years of repeated contact, genuinely familiar in the way that a second city becomes familiar, not just visited but known. The people who accompanied him on some of these private visits have described an experience of being in public with Freddie Mercury that was fundamentally unlike the same experience anywhere else in the world. The absence of event, the absence of the specific heightening of atmosphere that his presence produced in every other context, the specific pleasure he took in being able to walk into a convenience store in Shinjuku and buy something and walk out again without the transaction becoming a spectacle. The relationship between Freddie Mercury and his Japanese fans was, by the accounts of people who observed it from close proximity, something unlike his relationships with fan cultures in any other country. Japanese Queen fans brought to their devotion a quality of knowledge and a quality of respect that operated differently from the devotion he encountered elsewhere. They knew the music in extraordinary depth, not just the hit singles, but the album tracks, the B-sides, the specific instrumental arrangements, the evolution of the band's sound across the decade. When they approached him, which they did, when the opportunity presented itself, with a care and a deference that was itself a form of recognition, they were not seeking the transaction of celebrity encounter that Western fans tended to bring to the same situation. They were expressing, with the specific vocabulary of Japanese fan culture, a form of appreciation that acknowledged the music as the primary thing and the person as the person who had made the music, rather than treating the person as the object and the music as the credential. This distinction, subtle to anyone who has not experienced both, made an enormous difference to Freddie Mercury. To be appreciated for what you made, rather than simply for the fact of being you, was the form of recognition that the performer in him had always most deeply wanted. The comparison between Munich and Tokyo, as Freddie Mercury's two major non-London centers of private life, is instructive precisely because the freedom they provided came from completely different sources. Munich gave him freedom through immersion, through a social world that was his own, that operated by rules he had chosen, that provided the specific liberty of being surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was and did not require him to manage their experience of that knowledge. Tokyo gave him freedom through invisibility, through the specific operation of a cultural convention that simply declined to treat his presence as an event, that allowed him to exist in public space as an ordinarily private person, regardless of his fame. Both were necessary. Both addressed a different dimension of what the conditions of his public life had made difficult. And the fact that he sought out both, that he built Munich and kept returning to Tokyo across the years of his career, is evidence that the question of how to be a private person inside a supremely public life was one he thought about seriously and addressed with the same intelligence and the same deliberateness that he brought to everything else. Garden Lodge, in the years after Freddie Mercury's death, has been described by the people who knew its interior as a space that carried the traces of everywhere he had loved. The specific arrangement of objects in the rooms of that house, the things he had chosen to live with and to look at every day, was a record of his aesthetic life in the most intimate sense, a three-dimensional autobiography of what he had found beautiful and what had mattered to him. Within that record, Japan was present with a prominence that few of his visitors failed to notice. The ceramics on the shelves, the woodblock prints on the walls, the lacquerware boxes on the surfaces, the kimonos that hung in the spaces he had designated for them. These objects were not decorative in the neutral sense of things chosen to fill a space. They were chosen with the specific intentionality of a person who understood each object individually, who knew where it had come from and what tradition it represented and what quality of craft it embodied, and who had placed it in his home because its presence there gave him something he needed from his daily surroundings. They were, among other things, the most physical evidence available of the private importance of Japan in Freddie Mercury's inner life, the most visible record of the fact that what Japan had given him went far beyond tour grosses and chart positions. In the final years of Freddie Mercury's life, in the period from 1987, when the diagnosis arrived, through to his death in November 1991, Japan became something he could not return to in the way he had returned before. The illness made sustained travel impossible beyond a certain point. In the very public nature of what would happen if a visibly ill Freddie Mercury were to appear in Tokyo, the attention, this photographs the speculation made the specific kind of private visit that had been possible in earlier years impossible in a different way. Peter Freestone has described Freddie during this period, sometimes talking about Japan, about specific places and specific objects in specific experiences, with the particular quality of attention that people bring to things they know they are remembering rather than anticipating. Not with self-pity, not with expressed grief about what was no longer possible, simply with the accurate and undefended recollection of someone who knew what they had had and was choosing to hold it clearly in memory rather than set it aside. The ceramics on the shelves of Garden Lodge, the streets of Shinjuku at night, the shops in Ginza where a very famous person could browse without the browsing becoming a performance. He had had those things. He held them. Queen's legacy in Japan in the decades since Freddie Mercury's death has been one of the most sustained and least diminished of any Western band in any international market. The devotion of Japanese Queen fans has not followed the trajectory of nostalgia that tends to govern the relationship between audiences and bands across time, the gradual softening of intensity, the migration of the core audience into memories rather than active engagement. It has remained present and specific and generationally self-replenishing in a way that continues to surprise people who study these things. Queen's legacy in Japan has outlasted everything. The devotion that began before Queen's Western breakthrough has never diminished, not after Freddie's death, not after John Deacon's retirement, not after 30 years of absence. Bohemian Rhapsody, the 2018 film, performed extraordinarily well there, not because Japanese audiences needed an introduction, but because it gave an existing devotion a new occasion to express itself. The relationship between Queen and Japan is the most durable evidence of something Freddie understood in 1975, that this particular audience and this particular music had found each other without the mediation of the music industry, and what had been found would not easily be lost. What Japan gave Freddie Mercury was not escape. It was something more valuable, the opportunity to be himself in public without performing himself. The Freddie who walked the streets of Tokyo was not the Freddie of Wembley or Live Aid. He was something more basic, a person in a city, moving at his own pace, with no obligation to be anything other than what he was in that moment. This is what most people take for granted as the ordinary condition of public existence. For Freddie Mercury, it was available in almost no city in the world. It was available in Tokyo. He walked down the street. He was simply there. It was enough.